Yes, I know, that's right.
He's going to turn to somebody and say, "Get this done."
And tell Wayne.
Never been to hunt.
I can tell Wayne to send it. We did 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 1, 2, 6, 7.
That's all the time.
Screaming, breaking that dollars. Look at our shoes. Hey, yeah. Oh, really? I do. These are the highest heels I have, I think. And they're skinny. Not yet. So much of a start. She was, but...
Good to see you. Good to be in the education. Yeah. She's doing fine.
You need anything from me?
Pass it all on.
I sure will.
First batch. Every $15.
He cut me off.
Almost every day I look and see what the pastor preached about.
But we'll see. Yeah, we will.
I was out there.
All right, take care.
Good seeing you. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I did. I called Claire. I've already run that route. Good to see you.
What do you guys miss?
There.
We did.
Just said he was going to miss all the strikes, though.
Let me say, good talking about it. Hey, Eric, hi, Mike Morgan. See you too.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bill Kobe, Chairman of the North Carolina State Board of Education, and I call this May 1st, 2018 State Board Planning and Work Session to order. Thank you to all the board members and advisors who are able to carve out this additional time from their busy schedules. These planning and work sessions provide us additional time needed for in-depth presentations on topics and issues of value and importance to this board and the public. I thank the staff in advance for the additional work for the planning and work session, in addition to our monthly board meeting, which will occur this Thursday. I also want to welcome Dr. Deanna Townsend Smith to the board staff and thank her for her transition from one very busy position in the Office of Charter Schools to this very busy position of Operations and Policy Director for the State Board. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Board members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this board. Does any member of the board know of any conflict of interest or appearance of conflict of interest with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring that matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in the discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the pleasure and honor of introducing our newest state board member representing the 5th Educational District. It's Mr. Alan Duncan of Greensboro. He is the chairman of the Guilford County's Board of Education and has served as chairman since 2002. You deserve a lot of credit and accommodation. I can't imagine. He is also a member of Governor Cooper's Commission on the Access to a Sound Basic Education. I like the fact that that'll give us a little bit of a tie to that commission. Thank you. He is a graduate from Davidson College and holds a law degree from Vanderbilt University. He is a partner in the Greensboro law firm of Mullins, Duncan, Carroll, and Russell, and has practiced for more than 30 years. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Duncan. And Mr. Duncan, as they welcome you, I'd like you to come forward to be sworn in by a justice of the Supreme Court of North Carolina, the Honorable Michael Martin. So please come forward.
Yes, Michael Morgan.
Michael Morgan.
Thank you, Chairman Colby. I learned the answer to anything. Don't worry about that.
Thank you.
It's my honor to be here. Superintendent Johnson, board members, public staff, and interested persons. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to be here on such an occasion as this to administer the oath. It's nice to have a chance on a beautiful May day to have an excuse to walk up 4 blocks for such an auspicious occasion. So thank you for this opportunity. I have you, sir, to hold the Bible, left hand holding it, raise your right. I will say all the words of your oath, and at the end of it, if you'll give a proper sign of assent, such as I will or I do. Do you, Alan Duncan, solemnly swear that you will support the Constitution of the United States? And do you, Alan Duncan, solemnly swear that you will be faithful and bear true allegiance to the state of North Carolina and to the constitutional powers and authorities which are or may be established for the government thereof, and that you will endeavor to support, maintain, and defend the Constitution of said state, not inconsistent with the Constitution of the United States? And do you, Alan Duncan, solemnly swear that you will well and truly execute the duties of your office as a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education, according to the best of your skill and ability, according to law, so help you God?
I do.
Board Member Duncan, congratulations.
Sign the documents. Thank you, Justice Michael Morgan.
My pleasure. And call on me anytime I can be of service.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Good luck to you. Thank you,
Okay.
Justice Morgan.
I'll go over there and we'll take care of the paperwork.
Good. Okay, I wanted to give Alan a chance to say a few words about coming on this board. So, Alan, please.
Thank you. I'll be brief. We have a lot of meeting materials. I want to thank the governor for appointing me. It's a true privilege to serve the citizens of North Carolina. Particularly, it's a privilege to serve the children in North Carolina and our wonderful educators and the people who work in our schools. We owe them great thanks and great debts of gratitude. We often don't express that well enough or often enough. So I hope that we all will continue to think in our minds that we cannot say thank you enough to the people who make our state work and who look after our most precious assets, which are our children. I want to thank Justice Morgan for being so kind to come over and swear me in. It's a great honor to have someone of your great ilk to do that. So thank you so much for doing that, Justice Morgan. And to the members of the board, it's a great privilege to get to serve with you. I look forward very much to the service we have together ahead. And thank you for the privilege of getting to work with you and be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sworn in, man. Sworn out.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan, and welcome aboard. It's good to have somebody with such extensive experience to come here to contribute to the work of the board. And I just wanted to point out to you that, our members of the board, that at your place I passed out new committee assignments. Were adjusted based on having a new vice chairman, so we've moved some things around. But this will not be effective until the May meeting. So we'll go through this meeting under the same committee structure that we had before this. I now recognize Dr. Maria Petrie Martin for an overview of our planning and work session.
Greetings to our chairman, our vice chair, our state superintendent, our board members, advisors, and all those assembled. We have a very full agenda to cover over the next 2 days of our planning meeting, and we are starting off today with our Ernst & Young report that provides an operational review for the Department of Public Instruction. You will hear many things shared during that report, but we know there will be a focus on supports to schools, which is a very nice segue into some of the agenda items that we have for you today. You'll also hear about creating a collaborative and data-driven culture here at the department, and recruitment and retention and development of staff here at the department. And again, all of these things flow nicely into several of the agenda items we have for you over the next 2 days. Also keep in mind that we are building off of the discussion we had in November at our last planning meeting. For example, at that particular meeting in November, we talked about the previous work of district and school transformation, as well as educator effectiveness. We know that those 2 areas of work have been consolidated into educator support services. Back in November, we gave you a very high-level overview of what we thought the new work of educator support services would be. Today, we are going to delve even deeper into that work. For example, we will discuss how we can tighten up the process for schools that enter into one of our reform models. We will also give you a draft of a proposed continuum of services and continuous school improvement model to address our low-performing schools. Often, we are asked at the department, what is in between when schools are implementing a reform model and not necessarily showing academic growth, and the possibility of them being considered in the ISD. So today we are going to discuss what could be an in-between continuum of services to address that question that we are often asked. Also, after that presentation, today you will, in the day, engaged in a facilitated discussion with staff from Educator Support Services so that we can have feedback from each of you regarding this proposed continuum of services. Then tomorrow, we will open up the day discussing professional learning for educators, specifically in the area of Indian education. Back in November, we had a thoughtful discussion about equity and what are we doing differently to address student groups so that every student has access to the resources and educational rigor they need at the right moment that they need it. So tomorrow you will see an example of a tool that has been created for our educators so that they can continue to seek strategies directly addressing the needs of our Indian education programs. Then we have the great opportunity of having 3 school districts join us tomorrow. Back in November, we had Iredell, Statesville, Hoke, and Halifax school systems joining us, and tomorrow we have Winston-Salem, Forsyth, Bladen, and Scotland, and they will be discussing their whole child NC pilots. After tomorrow, you will have seen 6 of the 11 pilot districts present information on the work of the Whole Child NC Committee in the hopes of providing further recommendations in October of 2018. Then we will move into academic discussion of NC check-ins, which started as a proof of concept and now provides teachers with immediate feedback for guiding instruction on the standard course of study. We are again fortunate to have Richmond County Schools joining us to talk about the journey they have taken with NC check-ins and how it has worked to improve their performance. And then finally, we will spend time talking about what is so critically important today and really every day, and that is safety in our schools. We will look at an operational definition of what safety in schools really should mean. We will look at data and possible improvements to safety efforts nationally and in the state of North Carolina. So as you can see, we have a full agenda planned, but all of these items will eventually lead us to a discussion of your state board strategic plan. We will bring a draft or work in progress of some metrics that we have been considering. But in light of the operational review and other things that you might hear, we are simply bringing this to you as a work in progress, and we will continue to seek your feedback going into next month. So again, we do have a full agenda for you, and at this time, I will turn it over to our state superintendent to introduce our Ernst & Young team.
Thank you, Dr. Peachy Martin. I'll let the, I'm going to give some thank yous to the staff in the department first before I introduce EY. I think everyone in the building knows that I was very excited and optimistic to have this work done by a third party, an operational review of the department to see where we are as a department now and where we can make improvements. I want to thank the steering committee members in DPI. They worked very closely with EY over the last few months to make this happen. Dr. Maria Peachy Martin, Adam Levinson, Jeannie Allen, Claire Miller, Michael Nicolaides, Michael Spanow, Donna Roach, and Adam Short. Thank you very much for putting in the time and working with this team. Also to the DPI staff that took time to be interviewed or give suggestions. We had over 100 staff, I believe, that took part in this, and also the over 100 external stakeholders, superintendents, principals, teachers, who also gave us feedback on what's working well and what's not. So all of that was taken, and I thank the staff for their willingness to work on this and their candor, especially throughout this process. I'm excited to share the report and recommendations with the state board, and this presentation will help us get a better understanding of where the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction is today and what steps we need to take and where we need to go. Again, keep in mind, please, these are recommendations based on feedback from internal and external stakeholders. And I hope that these recommendations really can serve as a path to modernize the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction in our ultimate goal of the best service to schools, teachers, students, and parents that we can provide across the state. So with that, I'll ask EY if you all can come on up, and I'll let you all introduce yourselves. And again, thank you very much for being here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Labrizzi.
Hi, I'm Deborah Kirshan.
So I'll take us through the presentation. Deborah and I have led this engagement together. Just by way of brief introduction before we get into the materials, I'm a partner with Ernst & Young. For those that we haven't had a chance to introduce ourselves to, EY as a firm, in addition to our broader audit, tax, and advisory businesses, we have a dedicated practice area in public education, having done engagements like this for other state education agencies. And we're also able to bring to this project folks who bring deep functional experience in areas related to HR, finance, and IT, where they're drawing lessons from both the public and the private sector. So we've been very grateful for the opportunity to do this work over the past few months. And just to echo what the superintendent said, we had a really great level of collaboration and cooperation and real openness from staff at the agency. And certainly received everything that we needed for the assessment by way of time and data. And having done this kind of work in other states, I can say that's not always the case. And so it's been a real pleasure. I want to recognize that we've done a lot of work over the past few months. And so the output of that work is a little voluminous. And you'll see in front of you that we've tried to unpack this at different levels of detail so that as you wade your way through the materials, you can sort of access different layers of detail as you go. So you note there's a sort of one-page summary on this laminated sheet. There is then our full final report and a related appendix, both of which are the official public documents for the project. During the time that we have here, I want to spend just a few minutes giving you all a sense of the process that we've gone through and our methodology. I'll spend about 25 minutes giving you a summary of our observations and recommendations. Certainly, if you have any clarifying questions, please jump in, but we're going to try to save the significant bulk of our time to allow you to ask questions, give us feedback, etc. Okay? Just to start us off, and just so you know, what's going to be up here on the page, on the screen behind you, is a subset of the slides in the final report. We thought it would be easier to just take you through the highlights rather than all the pages in the report. So starting off a little bit with just context, this is a project that we have undertaken over the last 12 weeks. And the goal of this assessment was to come in with a very open mind and simply to help identify opportunities for greater effectiveness or efficiency, or both, across the agency. It is not a study that is specifically geared toward cost savings or financial implications, but certainly where we have identified recommendations, we've also tried to identify the financial implications of those recommendations. We'll talk some more about the feedback that we got, but as the superintendent described, it's been extensive. And we gathered all sorts of data from the agency, a comprehensive set of information related to the agency's budget, its personnel, organizational structure, and significant information having to do with agency strategy or business processes and technology systems. All of that input and the data was then the basis for the recommendations we have made, of which there are 18. And I'll describe those 18 recommendations to you in detail as we go through. But they relate to overarching themes around impact, support, technology, and people. And I think we'll talk about this again more as we go, but the themes that we hope come clearly through these recommendations is that we believe there is an opportunity for these recommendations to increase the agency's impact on the field of public education here in the state by reducing silos in the way that the department works and by delivering on a more consistent vision for how to improve teaching and learning. And we believe that there's an opportunity to better enable and focus the agency's work on its core mission by making sure the resources of the agency are directed toward the core work of its educational mission, and that there's a process of upgrading and modernizing the underlying business processes and systems, which are critical for the people here to be able to do their work effectively. And in sum, we think that this is a substantial body of work and has the potential to represent a real transformation of the agency to the benefit of ultimately educators and students across the state. There were some, while our scope was broad and generally encompassed almost every part of the agency, there were some areas of the agency that, by the terms of the scope as defined by the state, were not a part of our assessment. You can see those listed on the page around the virtual public schools, the residential schools, the innovative school district, etc. With respect to the licensure division, that was not in our scope to assess because DPI had previously and just recently commissioned a report specifically to make recommendations around the licensure division. Though we did try to incorporate the licensure division into some of our broader thinking about talent-related functions within the agency, as well as just to check ourselves about whether our recommendations were broadly in line with the other report, and I think generally speaking, they are. To summarize a bit the feedback that we got, as the superintendent described, we had really extensive opportunities to hear from stakeholders internally and externally. More than 200 people in total, split roughly equally between DPI leadership and staff, and a wide range of stakeholders and educators in the field, from superintendents through district staff, principals, and teachers. We were able to do this through one-on-one interviews, through focus groups, and to ensure that there was the broadest possible opportunity for people to submit feedback, a sort of open survey internally and externally to allow anybody who wanted to submit feedback to give it. All of those conversations were extremely helpful. I'd also like to add that in the end, we didn't develop these recommendations in a vacuum. They've been the result of an opportunity to collaborate, workshop, and refine those recommendations through feedback. We held a day-long workshop with almost 25 leaders here in DPI to talk through and further refine the recommendations in detail. And we were able to begin to socialize and gather feedback at the regional superintendent's meeting just a few weeks ago. I'm sure there will need to be more opportunities to continue to engage with the field, but we've had some of that opportunity. Certainly, in the end, what you're getting from us is our objective opinion, but it was helpful and important to have the opportunity to gain feedback and to refine our collective thinking, and hopefully, I think, to gain some buy-in and support from the leaders here who have to carry this work forward. Are there any questions just related to our process before I dive into the content of the work? Great. Before we get into the recommendations and the observations themselves, I want to recognize that, of course, that all exists within a context. And we've spent a lot of time making sure that we have an appropriate understanding of the context of the department and of the field of public education here in the state. And I just want to take a few pages to share some of that with you and make sure that we're all operating from a level set. DPI, like other state education agencies, carries a sort of dual set of responsibilities around, you could characterize it as compliance and support. You could characterize it as its strategic priorities and its traditional obligations. But certainly through the state's plan for ESSA and other priorities that the superintendent and his team have expressed, there are a set of priorities that the agency has begun to articulate for how it would support improved education here in the state, personalized learning, early learning, literacy, college and career readiness, etc. And the department has to figure out how to best to invest in and support those priorities while also maintaining the typical responsibilities that any state education agency has that relate certainly to policy and academics, but also operations and administration, and that have a fair amount of compliance and monitoring responsibilities that are inevitably a part of the agency's work. Though the strategy and the formal responsibilities of the agency color everything about our assessment, and we wanted to make sure that all of our recommendations would be in line with what the agency is obligated to provide. Of course, the agency's work is also inevitably a function of what are the needs of districts in the state. And this graphic that you see in front of you and that is on page 13 of the final report is just one way to visualize what is the landscape of school systems that DPI needs to work with and support across the state. And while there are, about 12 districts of more than 25,000 students that represent a little bit less than just under half of all the students in the state, there are so many more school systems across the state that are operating in rural communities and in many cases at a very small scale that limits those systems' abilities to invest in different kinds of expertise themselves, and that certainly colors the way that DPI has to think about support and relationships with the field. And we got an opportunity to hear from a fairly wide range, of superintendents and educators from all parts of this chart, and the variety of their different capacity and orientation certainly has colored our recommendations. We also spent a lot of time making sure that we had a proper understanding of the budget here in the agency, all of the funds that flow to and through DPI, both to help promote that understanding more broadly and to think about whether there are any opportunities to improve the allocation of resources. So at a very high level, there is $11.6 billion that flows through DPI, 99% of which goes straight out to the field of local education agencies. $130 million of which is retained here as really the budget for the central agency's work. You can see a brief breakdown in terms of how that relates between personnel and operating dollars. I think a different way to think about that, not just sort of personnel and operating, is what is this money ultimately going to support? And the answer there, again, on a sort of visualization behind you, these are categories that hopefully are reasonably intuitive to you, though they're not necessarily the same categories that are always used to present this information. Shows that you have basically $100 million of the $130 million budget going to support academics, districts, and schools. That's, you can see the range of academic divisions, and there's $66 million of spend. Districts and school support, that includes both academic support and educator support services, but also, the work of federal programs and monitoring, as well as a range of different school operations support that the agency provides. Of course, the remainder of the spending has to do with sort of the core business functions of the agency, which are critical to making the department work and enabling support to the field. As you think about that $130 million, where it comes from and how it could ever be changed, I think it's important to recognize that the reality is this budget is significantly carved up across many, many different funding streams, most of which have significant restrictions on how they can be deployed. So on the page that that's up on the screen now, which is number 17 in the report, this is a view of the sort of $90 million of the budget that goes to academics, district, and school support. And you can see in the letters all the different streams that this represents between state and federal funding streams, special, and as well as sort of special funds, those are the purple, and receipts in yellow. And I didn't just, we're obviously not going to go through every stream here, but just sort of on the sheer visual impact of it, you can see how much of the work having to do with academics, districts, and school support comes through a variety of federal funding streams, which are largely somewhat restricted, as well as in blue, categorical state revenue streams that are specific to certain types of work. By contrast, the funding picture for the underlying business operations and functional areas of the department across technology services, finance and business, the superintendent's office, et cetera, is much more funded by general state appropriations that are somewhat more discretionary in nature. And so there's just a different set of questions that you can ask when you're thinking about resource allocation issues with relatively more discretionary funds and relatively more restricted funds. Okay? So look, these slides are not intended to give the answer in and of themselves, but I think it's important. It was important for our team and hopefully important for all the stakeholders who will view this report to sort of proceed from a common understanding of what dollars are we talking about and how are different functions within the department supported today financially. As we got into our assessment, obviously we're going to talk about some constructive observations and recommendations for improvement, but I want to recognize that we heard a lot of positive things too, and that we did not make recommendations for improvement in every single area of the agency. You know, we had an opportunity, just as one example, to get together with a group of really high-performing teachers. And what we heard by and large was a feeling that DPI is responsive to their needs and that they respect the level of expertise and knowledge that the staff here brings to bear and value the breadth and range of professional development services that are provided. And again, having done this kind of work in other states, it's not always the case that if you got together with a group of really strong teachers, you'd hear compliments about a state education agency's work. We certainly observed and we heard that many parts of the department bring a really strong service orientation to their work. It's a committed and mission-oriented group of people who want to support districts and schools, even when that goes beyond what is mandated or what their job description formally describes. And that's even more so the case today, where you have employees across the agency and often assuming additional responsibilities because of either budget cuts or vacancies in the agency that have not been able to be filled. And so, you know, we really reflect on this to say there's a lot of good that is happening here and some momentum that can be built off of. And certainly an opportunity where the dedicated and knowledgeable staff that is in the department today, there's an opportunity here for the department to really take hold of the work that is recommended by way of transformation and to carry it forward. And I'll note that in areas like school operations and federal programs monitoring, we did not make any recommendations for improvement in those areas because we heard value for some of that work from the field. And we think in many cases there have been leading practices that have been adopted there over the years. At the same time, we did hear and we did observe through our data analysis a number of issues that we thought do lend themselves to some real improvement. And I mentioned earlier these 4 categories around impact, support, technology, and people. I'll just briefly describe some of the headline observations that motivated our recommendations. First of all, and this is not a unique observation for state education agencies as a species, but it is no less important here in North Carolina, the effectiveness and the impact that this organization can have is limited by its tendency to work in silos. And that is an observation that extends across many functional areas in the department. It extends to how data is accessed and used, how policy is developed, how budgets are created and resources are allocated. The limitations that these silos impose are real. So a lot of our recommendations sort of have at their heart, how could we be more effective if we were less siloed? Related to that, in terms of support, historically and even today, support is delivered to districts and schools mainly through the lens of individual office by office approaches. And the question that I think we would raise through our work is, what is the overriding theory, not office specific, but across offices, for what this department can do to best support districts and educators to drive student outcomes. And that's a matter not just of strategy, but of delivery. If you look across the offices that are focused on teaching and learning and academics here in the department, each of them often have their own teams that develop and then deliver supports within regions across the state. Those teams don't necessarily coordinate and interface with each other about what they're seeing, how they would calibrate the needs, and how they can best coordinate support. In terms of technology, there are a far-reaching set of observations and recommendations here in the report. What we have generally seen is that over the years, certainly as technology has become more important to the delivery of instruction and education in the field, you have program areas across the department who are demanding and needing technology to be a part of their work. You have a sort of IT group within the agency that is limited by what it can provide because it is doing a lot of things, and we'll talk about that. And it has led to divisions having to develop their own, or choosing to develop their own IT resources across the agency. And overall, a sort of sense of fragmentation and a lack of coordination with respect to deployment of IT resources and an overall strategy and governance around data and IT. One of the things that we observe related to that is that some of the things that IT here in the agency is dedicating time to are not necessarily the most value-added functions that are closest to the mission of the department. And so as we talk about IT and the recommendations there, I just want to emphasize that we think there is a really critical role for IT within DPI, but we should think about that role being focused on the educational mission of the department, and where there are things that are more administrative in nature that are not central to that mission, could we think about other ways of delivering those services? Finally, with respect to people, the most obvious issue in the department today is the challenges of getting people on board. There are a significant number of vacancies in the department. Those vacancies have a real impact on the ability of the department to deliver on its work. And the time it requires today to fill those vacancies or to create a new position is substantial. It's also been a challenging time for the department with respect to employee engagement and morale. There have been high levels of turnover and challenges with respect to communication, which are not unique to any large organization, but still are a real issue. And when we think about the opportunity for transformation that we'll talk about, employee engagement has to be a foundational issue. And so those observations lead us to our recommendations. And this sort of graphic behind you, and that is page 23 of the report, and also here on the front cover of your little placemat, for lack of a better phrase. These are the 18 recommendations that ultimately form the backbone of our report. They fall into those same 4 categories. Generally speaking, we think there's an opportunity to transform DPI into a collaborative, data-driven, and student outcomes-focused organization. We think there's an opportunity to create a more integrated and streamlined system of support to districts. We think there's an opportunity to redefine and restructure IT to be more lean and agile and designed around the most value-added supports. And we think that there are more steps that can be taken to recruit, retain, and develop the right team to drive that mission forward. The final recommendation, number 18, is more cross-cutting in nature. It says, well, if you agree and want to move forward with those 17 recommendations, it's a substantial body of work for a group of people who are pretty busy with their day jobs, and that is going to require coordination across these recommendations so we don't implement the transformation in the same siloed way that we've observed in the challenges. And so recommendation 18 relates to the notion of a transformation management office that would be likely a sort of temporary set of capacity over the next year or so. but that could help to drive and coordinate the work of implementing these recommendations. I really want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to internalize and digest the recommendations themselves. But of course, there's a lot there, and so I don't want to go too much through each one individually. I suspect we can do some of that in questions and feedback where you would like to dive deeper. Let me just briefly observe a few things in each of the 4 quadrants here. When starting with impact, when we talk about a more collaborative, data-driven, and student outcomes-focused organization, those relate to functions of the department that are cross-cutting in nature. It relates to how we use data and analytics. Today, data is drawn from multiple systems, multiple users. It is both more time-consuming than it should be and not always clear how you would get the information that you need. That data can be brought into one place, and there's an opportunity as you do that to really upgrade the analytics capability, both people and tools that exist here in the department, and in some cases to leverage investments that are being made across the state. This theme around impact relates to the notion of a policy and strategy function within the agency, the role of which would be to facilitate collaboration and feedback around agency priorities. Today, policies that come to you or policies that come through the General Assembly are often developed also on an office-by-office basis. And there are some mechanisms for coordination, but they are inconsistent in their implementation. And when we heard from the field, what we heard is a desire from superintendents and educators to be able to provide feedback and have more clear avenues for feedback into how policy is developed. There's an opportunity, we think, to institutionalize how those feedback mechanisms are applied. Another part of making the department more collaborative and outcomes focused is around how division leaders are engaged as owners of their budgets. Do they know the resources? Are they being strategic and involved as business owners in how their priorities are reflected in the way dollars are used? And then there are significant recommendations as it relates to the contracting process, which, similar to hiring, is a major bottleneck for the agency today. With respect to support and the recommendations in that quadrant, it starts off with this notion of redesigning a regional structure to better coordinate and differentiate supports to LEAs. I want to pause on this point because I do recognize that in the past, the department has had things that looked like a more regional structure for delivering support. And we've obviously tried to be cognizant of some of those lessons learned in how you would think about moving forward. And I guess I would say that just because we have had a regional approach in the past doesn't mean that that idea is not in some way the right one. What it means, I think, is that we shouldn't interpret this recommendation as limited to moving boxes around on an org chart. It is really about what are a broader set of changes that can affect behavior and the way services and supports are delivered in the field to achieve greater impact for the resources that you have. And so if the creation of a more regional structure is combined with a more consistent theory for which are the programs and the menu of options that the agency wants to support because data suggests they can be effective, and is combined with a more streamlined approach to needs assessment in the field. So you don't have each office doing an assessment of the field's needs, you have a more synthesized and coordinated assessment of needs in each region. Then there's an opportunity not just to change organizational structure, but to change and improve the way that services are delivered to the field so that they're more coordinated and focused on the highest impact programs. There's similarly, we think, an opportunity to better coordinate how assessments are developed and rolled out. At a minimum, what we hear is, for example, in the early grades, educators perceive a wide range of assessments that are out there, sometimes unclear as to what is optional and what is not. And at a minimum, there's an opportunity for the department to better coordinate messaging and planning and rollout of those assessments. And you may even find as you go through that there's an opportunity to streamline assessments. We think similarly to assessments, which is something that gets developed across different parts of the department, support for educators, for teachers, and talent-related issues within districts is also something that lives in different homes within the department. And we think it would be ultimately more effective if all of the talent-related functions of the agency were brought together in one group. And then finally, another aspect of support that the agency provides to the field is around IT support. That is a frustrating experience for many in districts today. The wait times are long, and there are opportunities to do better. With respect to technology, I would encourage you to view the recommendations here as very much mutually reinforcing. What we are really talking about as a body of recommendations is to, first of all, bring together, we need to wrap our arms around all of the IT resources that exist within the department. This phrase of quote unquote shadow IT is a kind of conspiratorial sounding phrase that is not meant to reflect that. It just means we've got IT that lives in different places. And we need to bring that together and then think in a unified way about what are the functions that the agency should really be providing.
Can I ask a question in the middle of this? The detail, obviously, I can't find the detail in some of this.
Sure.
So tell me, I'm assuming where we are at this point is looking at these broader themes that are recommendations.
Yep.
And then I guess the implementation phase is to come. Does that make sense?
Well, it is true that there's an implementation phase to come. But it is also true that there is a substantial amount more detail available to you than what is reflected on this page that we're looking at. So just as
But it is somewhere in this 106 slides. Right?
Yeah. So like if you look at if you have the report.
Well, humor me on this one.
Yep.
Number 6.
Yep.
Redesign of regional structure. There's somewhere in there a process that will get us there.
Yeah.
I only got these.
Yeah. So, and I realize there are different materials in front of you depending on if you're looking online or on paper, but in the report itself.
Yeah, give me that. Okay. Yeah.
The detail around recommendation number 6 is on page 45. Every recommendation in the report has 2 pages each of detail associated with it, and then references additional pages in the appendix that provide even more detail on the recommendation. So in the case of number 6, you can find more specific detail that starts to look at positions within individual divisions and organizational structures and benchmarks. That's all available in the appendix.
Okay, and I got this last night. Am I by myself? I got this, I think, yesterday. So, okay, so I just want to make sure I didn't overlook, kind of go through, like regional structure matters. The farther away from Raleigh you are,
For sure.
the more people, that's, for the last 100 years, that's been code word for, we're going to bring it back to Raleigh. And you know, I've had folks right here say, we're going to have this major conference in Western North Carolina. It's going to Charlotte. And that's not in the West, in spite of what Eric might think it is. It's and so it's the way we do business, not necessarily where. Is that making sense to you?
I agree with that.
Okay. Yeah, I see that. Yeah. Okay. I'll get there.
Okay. And
That's
look,
fine.
so we provided the report was final as of Friday, but certainly I recognize there's a lot here, and if there are questions beyond today, we're obviously happy to discuss them.
Thank you.
Just briefly, the final area of recommendations relates to people These are the recommendations around how can we streamline and accelerate the hiring process, the role of HR overall in the way that division spends time today, and thinking about employee engagement and a more focused strategy around employee engagement and compensation as you go forward. So look, I know that I am giving you a flyover of a lot of stuff, but again, I just wanted to briefly introduce, and then I hope we can have some time for questions. Just a few more pages. Again, you can think about the recommendations at the level of the 18 individual areas. I just want to reinforce that from our standpoint, the recommendations are ultimately about two main themes. How do we increase impact on the quality of public education in North Carolina today by reducing internal silos and delivering a more consistent vision for improvement in teaching and learning? And how do you enable the agency to provide improved support by better focusing its resources on the core mission and by modernizing critical systems and processes? You know, I think a fair question of any assessment like this is, well, what's the through line between these recommendations and student outcomes? And I hope you can see that in some of the things that relate to support. But I would also say that this agency is not going to be able to deliver on the work of student outcomes with some of the technology systems and key business processes in the state that they currently are. We have this recommendation around a transformation management office. I won't belabor you with the details of this particular framework, but I am happy to discuss it more. I do think that in any transformation effort that it is as broad and multifaceted as the one that we're describing with these recommendations, it's necessary and important to have a body that can oversee that coordinate, and that can dive in more deeply with specific subject matter expertise where that's required. Now, like I mentioned, this is a substantial body of work. It's very multifaceted. It's not the kind of thing that you would try to do all at once. And we have had an opportunity through socializing and working with leaders here in the department to start to think about, where would you begin? And is there an opportunity to build some momentum? And the sort of bubble chart that's on the page behind you, and that is in the report, page 30, reflects input from leaders across the agency who assess themselves, having sort of talked through the recommendations. Hey, where do we think, which ones have a shorter or longer time frame? Which ones are more or less complex? And where's the greatest impact? And at a basic level, we would say that there is an opportunity to think about how do you build momentum for this work by starting with the things that can be done most quickly, with the least complexity, with the greatest impact. And so you'll see graphically on the left-hand side and in writing on the right that the recommendations around developing a policy and strategy function that better coordinates policy and feedback across the agency, improving the contracting process, aligning and coordinating assessments, and streamlining the hiring or talent acquisition process are, from our standpoint, based on the input we received from leaders here in the agency, some really logical places to start that can help you build momentum quickly. At the same time, we think all these recommendations are important. And so you would ultimately want to have a coordinated plan for how all of these recommendations can be moved forward over a period of time. And the timeline that you have in front of you is something that would certainly need to be refined and developed into more of a specific implementation plan. But I think it illustrates a few things. One is, reasonably speaking, the timeline for fully implementing all these recommendations is measured in years, not months. At the same time, there is some logical sequencing to some of these recommendations. Some things that can't start until other things have been accomplished. And so there is still a lot that we think would make sense to start this year. And you can sort of see that by the recommendations that are aligned against sort of a mid-2018 timeframe. Finally, I'll just comment on financial implications. As I mentioned, we entered this engagement with an open mind with respect to financial implications. We were looking and open to any needs for investment, either one-time or ongoing, as well as any opportunities for efficiency that might flow from our recommendations. And each of the recommendations in the supporting slides that you have details out the rationale for the financial implications of each recommendation more specifically. Not every recommendation has financial implications. In many cases, our perspective is that these could be implemented without any impact on the budget. That said, there are some areas that we think would require more, and others that over time could result in efficiencies. You can see that as you go through here. For example, the recommendation around bringing data together, housing it in one more modern and interactive system, is a recommendation that would require investment. It is also a recommendation that overlaps with some of the work that is being done through the business systems modernization effort. And so there may be a set of resources that you could use there to support that investment. We think that the recommendation around a policy and strategy function is likely one that would necessitate the creation of new positions, and so there's an implication of incremental spend in that first row. When you get to the recommendations around a more integrated and streamlined system of support to LEAs, we think there are potential savings there, both on the academic side and the IT side. At the same time, we point out, as it relates to academics, that if you could deliver support more efficiently, but you were getting more impact for that support, then there would also be an argument to be made that instead of taking those savings, we should reinvest those savings to increase the level of support that's being provided to the field. Certainly, we heard from superintendents and educators in our sessions that they have felt the impact of reduced support as Race to the Top and other funds have come off the books over the past few years. With respect to IT, there is a mix of both investment and savings. Some of the savings would come from shifting functions that are today delivered in-house here at DPI, either to DIT or to third-party vendors.
I have a question. How
Please.
is that a cost savings overall?
Well, if it goes to DIT, I think it depends on how it's implemented. But I would say that from the perspective of this agency, it's those areas that we've recommended moving to DIT are ones that we don't think are at the core mission of the department to provide desktop support and things of that nature. And from the state's overall budgetary standpoint, I would think that there's an argument to be made that if those functions are consolidated increasingly within DIT, then there's a better opportunity to manage those supports from the standpoint of the efficiency of the state's overall budget.
And you also recommend looking at outside vendors. So is that going to be a cost savings?
I don't think I wouldn't recommend proceeding with an outside vendor if it was going to cost more. We haven't gone through the process, obviously, of soliciting bids, but our team's sense is that, yes, there would be an opportunity to achieve cost savings by, like, if you think about the cost that these services are currently representing in the budget, that they could be done more efficiently in some cases by third-party vendors. There's a need for coordination there because I think DIT would have to be a part of that conversation, and you would want to explore what could be done by DIT and how efficiently that could be done as a part of the overall assessment.
Okay. I have a lot of specific questions, and this probably isn't the place to ask them, but I just have a lot of questions about the IT. I understand the state division of technology requirements, but I'll save those for when we have more specific questions about these recommendations.
Okay. And then I think the last piece is around, you know, and invest the $100,000 of investment that is in the fourth row relates to an investment in a position to support learning and development. Training, learning, and development is not really a function that is particularly well developed within the department today for staff. The net impact of these recommendations involves investment to the tune of around $4 million, we would estimate, though both of those areas of investment may overlap with investments that would be on the agenda of the business systems modernization plan. And then savings of up to $5 million or more. Again, the way in which those savings are ultimately realized at the level of the state's budget is dependent on some of how the implementation with DIT or other partners would be executed. That is the summary and the overview that I wanted to provide. I know that it's a lot. I'm sure you will have questions, and I'd welcome taking questions here. And if there are other questions that you'd prefer to sort of ask or discuss once you've had an opportunity to digest the recommendations a bit more, then I'd be happy to do that as well. But thank you very much for your patience through a lot of detail, and welcome comments.
Just let him acknowledge you.
A lot of information. Y'all did this in 2 months. That's incredible. Did EY consider any of the external stakeholders in this, of encouraging ways that that DPI's customers could consolidate, or our customers could reduce the number of things they're requesting? There could be something that way. For example, there are 115 LEAs. There's over 180 charter schools, but so those are all customers.
Yes.
Did that come up at all as far as ways to become more of a wholesaler than a retailer in our model?
Well, if I understand you correctly, you know, we did the scope of the overall assessment. We were asked to focus on the department as an agency, its structure, and its work. So different ways of organizing LEAs and the priorities they have, or the way in which they consume supports and organize amongst themselves, was not really within the scope of what we were asked to take on.
Okay, 2 other quick questions. The comparison, you mentioned that you've done some things in other states, and they're all different, and they work with you differently. How do we match it? How do we stack up that way? Can you give us a grade? I mean, everybody gets a grade.
I think I'm going to defer on offering a letter grade, but I'll give you some thematic observations, if that's okay. I think that in some areas, what we heard would be better than what we would hear in other state agencies. And I would, in particular, compliment that there's areas of the professional development that the agency provides that are really highly valued. And I would say state education agency PD sessions are not always highly valued by educators in other states. I think that there has been good work done over the past years to try to streamline and make easier the process of monitoring and compliance around some federal programs. Like, I would have entered this project with a hypothesis that there was more of an opportunity for efficiency there, and I don't really know that. I'm sure there's always continuous improvement, but there's not a lot of big rocks have been addressed. And I think that one thing that's interesting about this agency relative to some other state education agencies is there are specific operational supports that are provided to districts, for example, in terms of building plans and insurance, that are not necessarily common for what other state education agencies would provide, but those supports are very highly valued in the field. And frankly, when you think about the number of small systems that are out there, you can see the logic for why it makes sense for the DPI to continue providing them. I would not say that any of the recommendations that we're making and the challenges that we've observed are unique to this state. You know, the way in which the department functions through silos is very common. State education agencies kind of grew up around funding streams that they supported. And there is a consistent challenge across states to think about how do we better coordinate and deliver a consistent message, not just a stream-by-stream message. And issues around IT and systems are issues not just for many state education agencies, but that are common across the public sector. So, you know, I would say there are some strong points, and I would say that there are issues here that you would find in other states as well.
So, just an observation that on the people side, the $100,000 recommended for human resources to be able to help in increasing the hiring, increasing retention. There is a fantastic numeric value to increase retention. I'll give it a nice way to say you're selling yourself short on number 16, because it really, if we can numerically say there are this many positions open, there are this many this many people have quit in the last you know, X number of days. If we can reverse those fortunes and be able to have, you know, desired retention, and there's an absolute number to that we could say as a cost benefit.
I agree with that. And, you know, you will see in the report there are specific numbers around the number of vacancies that are in the department across offices. You'll see numbers on the number of contractors who have been brought on board across divisions, which in many cases is because that's the only way to get somebody in. And I think there is a significant and real benefit to that, not just in terms of dollars and cents, but in terms of impact on the field. Right. You know, I think we've felt that it's important for the dollars we put in front of you to not be subject to, like, and we've tried to be as literal and direct as we could. And so in a number of areas, I think you could argue, oh, well, down the line, are these other benefits, and could you make an estimate? But you should understand that the dollars we've put in front of you are limited to pretty direct impacts.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. It's just fascinating material and things to think about. My question is, I have a couple of questions, and one might put you on the spot for just a minute, but it goes this way. On a Likert scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being terrific, streamlined, to 5 being all over the map.
Uh-huh.
How siloed are we?
I don't know, these numbers are hard, right? 'Cause I don't know, what's a 5? But you know, pretty siloed. And
pretty siloed. That's
pretty
about
siloed.
A 3, a 4.
Yeah, you know, I think that's probably fair. Mm-hmm. And you know, like I mentioned, it's not just you see it in a lot of different functional areas. You see it with respect to academics. You see it with respect to IT. You see it with respect to how budgets are developed. You see it with respect to how policy is developed. You see it with respect to how data is used. And these are all really important areas that go to the heart of the department being as effective as it can be.
My other question has to do with, it would probably be a management issue or operational management, something like that, but it's about how can an agency such as DPI go through transformation within the normalcy of life?
Yeah, I think it's a really good and important question as you think about going forward. And I would make a few observations for what I have seen in terms of other organizations that have undertaken a similar kind of effort. Mm-hmm. First of all, like I mentioned, I think it is important that you identify some people and positions who can think about transformation as their job, not as this thing that they're trying to manage while they're also doing everything they're otherwise supposed to do. And so that's, you know, this notion of, you know, somebody who's leading a transformation management office is important. Second of all, it is hard for any organization to transform itself. And as you go through that process, I think it is really valuable to design a structure where you are consistently getting both internal and external feedback. You know, forcing yourself to confront feedback from the outside and to gain different perspectives is really valuable to keeping the process honest and giving different people a voice. The third thing I would say is that some of this transformation is likely to require a level of subject matter expertise that is hard for the department to identify on its own. In particular, this is probably the case in terms of some of the recommendations that relate to IT governance and systems more generally, to things like the contracting process and HR systems that underlie today's hiring processes and the challenges there. Some of this, to do that transformation work as effectively as you can, just relies on a high level of technical knowledge. So those are some of the things that I think can be helpful in making this possible to execute effectively.
Thank you.
I feel a little deja vu, I'm going to call you Mr. Secretary because that's where my mind's going deja vu with you being Secretary of Environment, Health, and Natural Resources. The silo thing that Olivia asked about is not unusual. It's not unusual in any agency.
Yep.
And the requirement, everything will begin to loosen and then has to be tightened. And so regardless of the structure, and at the end of an implementation plan, it's still going to require management.
Yes.
And managing horizontally and vertically, assuring that there are teams working on functions as opposed to as opposed to the silos, because the silos will continue to be there because of the funding structure.
Right.
So I just would encourage as we move forward to remember that. There are also some uncontrollable variables relative to this department. There are a lot of variables that are associated with state contracts and IT and other partners out there. And finally, I'm trying to get, and I'm beginning to get an understanding. I see this as a performance audit, and it's not quite a performance audit. It's not a financial audit, but it's
right.
It's an audit, and for me, that is yes, what's required by law, federal and state. What's required by policy. What is and what are the resources and the structure necessary to get there? My question is the alignment of ESSA, of this board's strategic plan, of other aspirational initiatives, whole child being one. How does all of that factor into the transformational efforts within the department?
Great. Yeah. Let me try to address those points in turn. So first, related to just what you said about the silos are always going to be there. It requires management. I just want to say we agree. And I hope everybody heard when I said things like the regional structure is not about just moving boxes around on an org chart. It's about changing ways of delivering supports to the field that are fundamentally, to your point, around management. Now, you also mentioned there are uncontrollable variables. I just wanted to note that in the detail for each of the recommendations, I mentioned earlier that there are 2 pages per recommendation in the body of the report, and one of the things that is addressed explicitly for each recommendation is the quote-unquote external dependencies that would have to be addressed in order for that recommendation to be fully implemented, whether those are dependencies that relate to other state agencies, to state statute, etc. We wanted to recognize those dependencies where they exist. At the same time, we thought it was important not to limit ourselves to recommendations that only could be implemented if nothing else changed in the world. The final piece, which was your question around how do things like the ESSA plan and the board's strategic plan relate to this transformation? Yeah, whole child. You know, you'll note here where it says increase impact on the quality of public education by reducing internal silos and delivering a more consistent vision for the improvement of teaching and learning. I think the question for the board and its strategic planning process and these other initiatives, as you're mentioning, is, well, what is going to be our consistent vision for improvement in teaching and learning? What are going to be the programs that you want to stand behind as the most valuable menu of options that you can offer to the field? And obviously you want those programs to be supported by data and evidence and research. And I think that what we are saying is, as you gain clarity and consensus on what that is, then you will also need to change both structure and management to be able to deliver that in a more consistent way. And so I would see that the ESSA plan, the whole child, the board strategic plan should all be vehicles by which the department expresses a consistent vision around the improvement in teaching and learning. And then hopefully this transformation speaks to how can we deliver on that vision as effectively and as efficiently as possible.
I'll do a follow-up to you if you don't mind, if everybody's. During the transformation process, which I think Olivia asked the right question, how do you run a wind sprint and put your shoes on at the same time? And that's kind of what we're trying to do. I think it's real important to have our external partners. I mean, you mentioned external review. I think it's also important. I want to just say it's important. Our external partners, and there are lots of them, need to be a part of that, and not just the customers, but our partners, and that's universities, community colleges, it's business, private sector, it's NC Best, it's North Carolina Chamber, on and on, of those that ought to participate in the development of that and clarity of that consistent vision that we're trying to achieve. So I hope that's part of that process as we move from where we are, which is, which we're seeing for the first time here now. But as this evolves, I think that's got to become clearer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Are these recommendations in light of the additional 13.9% in cuts that are legislated for next year? Like, is that, I'm a bit confused by the numbers. Are we looking at the existing budget and saying there are 113 vacancies, but we have the money to fill those? Or are we saying, I guess I'm just confused.
Sure.
So next year's budget is supposed to be decreased. Is that saying we can do this with the money we're being allocated next year?
We were asked to assess the agency as it exists today with its budget today.
Okay.
So that's the most direct answer to your question.
Yeah.
What will or will not transpire with next year's budget, is not for us to say.
That answers my question. Thank you.
But did I see that you all are recommending not to have the cuts this year if we're going to implement these recommendations? I thought I read that somewhere.
I believe that might have been mentioned in a letter from the department.
Yes, that will. You saw that in the cover letter that would be going to the General Assembly with this, which I believe you'll be voting on if you approve on Thursday.
The one that's due today, actually, to the General Assembly, that report.
Yes.
Yes. You can probably vote on it today if you'd like.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I just am making sure I've got the right one.
I didn't understand you, Tricia. Are you saying that you're going to recommend that we not have that cut for the second year of the biennium?
Yes, thank you. Chairman Kobe has a copy of it, and I hope you all have a copy printed.
It's
but the language is
on the last page.
In the report, page 5. In the report. Next to last paragraph.
And this is a report we would need to approve to go to the General Assembly.
And you are recommending that they not implement the second year of the biennium?
Yes.
That they would have to proactively rescind last year's Bill, yeah, okay.
Okay, I just want to be clear that we're all recommending that, because I don't know that we've had this conversation overtly before.
We have not.
That's good.
I have one final question. At the end of the day, when you, no, let me back up and not go that way. Let's say in the middle of your audit, you were well into the work of talking with people and gathering data and looking at systems and so on and so forth. Did you ever come to a point where your team could walk away and say, DPI, NCDPI in North Carolina is about doing A, B, C, and D? I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, I think I think I understand what you're referring to. And, you know, I would reference one of the observations that was made, and I think it says, NCDPI appears to lack an overriding theory for how to support LEAs and educators to drive student outcomes. Again, I think what our team observed is that there is a lot of good work happening within divisions. A lot of good work that's respected by the field, work that presumably is having impact. But that there is an opportunity to make that work greater than the sum of its parts if it's implemented through a vehicle where it's more coordinated and reflects a set of priorities that everybody here in the department and in the field can understand and internalize. So, you know, to your point, and CDPI is about doing A, B, and C, D. There's a lot of A, B, and C, and D that's happening that is really good. I think what we're speaking to is more about how those things can be crystallized and coordinated and delivered in a more consistent way.
It's almost like a branding question. What brands the department? Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, you got it.
Yeah, sorry. Well, thanks for doing this work for us. I'm interested in more of your thoughts around the transformation office.
Mm-hmm.
How large should it be? What kind of skills should, you mentioned some skills that I found that to be very helpful. You know, how large should it be? What kind of skills? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's first start with what kind of skills. There's certainly an aspect of the work which is about, you could call it project management, by which I don't mean like formal IT project management, but how do you take a transformation plan which is very multifaceted and make sure that all the pieces are well coordinated, that the sequencing is thoughtful, that connections and linkages are made dynamically where they need to be, and that there is some mechanism for reporting out progress in a way that is transparent and useful to stakeholders. All of that, the kind of things, are a set of skills that I'm referring to as project management. I think there's certainly a set of skills around communications and stakeholder engagement. It's going to be, this is a process of change for the department, first and foremost, and for your interactions with other state agencies and with districts. And how you go through the process of transformation so that it's not just about, hey, I implemented this initiative, check, 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 but you're bringing people along through that process. There's a set of skills there.
Yeah, change management.
Change management. And I think the third set of skills that I would reference are more in the category of what I referred to earlier as technical skills. You would, if you want to be able to do this as quickly and efficiently as possible and get the best results, then you want to think about where would there be a need to access a level of technical expertise that doesn't necessarily reside within the department. And again, I mentioned IT and sort of HR and contracting systems as some examples of where you might think about that. You know, so those are, I think, the kinds of skills that are important for this office. As to how large it is, I would be reluctant to offer a number. I would just say that it will depend in part on how much of it you view as sort of an internal versus external. You know, if you tried to, for example, provide all that the technical staff with internal resources, then it's going to look like one thing. If you contracted for certain things, then you would have a different number of FTEs, but it has to be thought of in sort of combination of the overall resources.
And it can expand and contract, I think, as needed also throughout the lifespan of the organization.
Right.
So did your financial implications include potential temporary costs to staff with some of these skills that either may not be in the department today or may be so tapped out that we need to bring in some outside resources?
Yeah, at this point, we have not tried to estimate what the cost required for the transformation management office would be. I think when you look at what we're saying around the timeline, you can sort of see where there's ebbs and flows of work over time. But some of the decisions around the specific level of resources and how you would source the talent for that, I think, is for the department to determine.
Okay. And to the timeline, you mentioned the sequencing chart. That really helps. But I see that this timeline assumes about a two and a half year implementation. In developing that picture for us, I know a lot of assumptions went into it that you don't know of and we don't have control over. But for instance, interaction that would be required from other state agencies, particularly around the human resource and technology issues. How were those things factored into coming up with this program? Yeah.
So let me just make sure I'm turning to the page so that we're all looking at the right thing.
I'm looking at page 18 of the deck.
So, you know, generally speaking, I think you were mentioning HR, for example. So if you look at recommendation 17 in that row, right? So it's broken into two chunks. It's all one recommendation, but for the purposes of the timeline, we thought about a review of job descriptions and classifications within the agency separate from an effort to make compensation more performance-driven on an annual basis. And the underlying idea behind sequencing there is just as you're describing. The second half of that would really depend on coordination with the legislature and with other state agencies, whereas some of the initial steps around how do we want to think about our job descriptions and classifications within the agency are things that could actually be a logical next step from some work that OSHR is doing right now around job classifications across the state. So where those things are clear, we've tried to organize the timeline in such a way that it roughly represents that logic. Now, whether or not the external dependencies to drive a more performance-driven approach to compensation would in fact be fully addressed by 2020 to start on the timeline that's on this page, well, you know, that's anybody's guess, but we've at least tried to reflect enough time to try to work that through between now and then.
Yeah, I'm really glad you made recommendation 17, because one of the things that's really hamstrung us is our ability to offer competitive compensation at the talent level that our students deserve and that DPI needs. I mean, the majority of the folks sitting behind you work for salaries that are just pennies on the dollar compared to what they could earn somewhere else. And in fact, compared to what they could earn in our school districts. So I think you really nailed it with 17 as something we need to work on.
Yeah.
Back to the internal and external part of the transformation office. So I can imagine there's one school of thought that says with external participation, we get independent thinking, fresh ideas, new energy, so forth. But it also runs the risk of it's being done to the department, not with the department. The converse is, you know, internal activity, internal resources, leadership, so forth, with the benefit that the group that is going to live with the results owns the transformation. Do you have any advice for us or comments on how to strike the appropriate balance?
Yeah. I guess what I would say is I've never seen something like this succeed if it is understood by people within the organization, within the department in this case, to be externally driven. to succeed, it has to be understood to represent not something that is defined and being worked on outside, but something that the organization comes to own as its work and its identity. At the same time, I don't know that I can think of an example of where something like this has been effective only with internal resources. So I think I would hypothesize that it can be neither entirely internal nor entirely external. The right balance is a more detailed question. But you asked earlier about the timeline. I just do want to at least refer you to one other thing, which is on the back side of this little placemat thing, there's an illustrative sort of timeline. I do think that you could roughly think about this in terms of what are we going to try to do in the next month, or the first month, whenever you want to start the clock. What are you going to do over the next 6 months? And then what lies beyond that? And I think that as you plot out an effort like this, there are some logical places to start, some logical ways to build a foundation and some momentum over the sort of the first 6 months. And then the tail of work that comes from that is sort of customized to how you want to think about sequencing these individual streams.
Okay, thank you.
I think you have seen that we are operating somewhat shorthanded at this point in time.
Yes.
And what I heard in the earlier comment, you said part of the transformation would be taking people from inside the department and make them part of the transformation office or team and relieving them of their day-to-day functions, which might be some of the top leadership within the department. Can you comment more on that?
Yeah, sure. I want to try to clarify some things about, I don't know if it's what I said or at least what I meant to say. Okay. I don't think it is possible to do this kind of thing where it's just like something you have to pack on top of your day job. At the same time, like I mentioned, I think that this is work that has to be owned within the department. And I would argue that as you think recommendation by recommendation, some of these things are not so far from what leaders within the agency already believe are their priorities and or work that they've already begun. And so, you can see, for example, on the timeline chart that's behind you, with things like number 14 and number 1 and number 4, like those little backwards arrows indicate, hey, some stuff has already started here. And similarly, I think certainly we've heard on the academic side of the organization that they want to be thinking about alignment and coordination and streamlining of assessments. And they want to be thinking about better coordination of supports regionally. That's right aligned with what they would say they want to be focused on with or without these specific recommendations. So in those cases where people's job really does align very well with the execution of these things, then I think there is an opportunity probably to leverage more time from the department. Some of these other things are just so either in-depth or technical in nature that it is hard to balance. For example, the recommendations, I think it's number 13, is about is about the portfolio of applications, IT applications and systems that the department manages. I mean, there's just a process of assessment and rationalization of those applications on a one-by-one basis and implementation of potentially new systems that is just kind of an intensive, somewhat one-time effort or series of one-time efforts that is harder to do like as a on-the-side kind of thing.
That is an example where you all pointed out the school business systems modernization project, which will be substantially more expensive, but deliver much better products for the department. So, I think when we look, I know that one of the goals, I remember number 1 in this ask for the superintendent to have this audit from the legislature was identify cost savings. And, I know you've done that in some places, but I do think I had the same question as Mr. Davis about the transformation office. Does it show any cost? But it's gonna, it has to, inherently, it will have some cost, even if it's, I know what you're saying about shifting, and the school business modernization is we already know that is budgeted and is substantially more expensive, so we are able to, embrace that as part of this, but, I just don't want anybody to think that it's possible to do quality work always with fewer dollars. I mean, sometimes it does require some resources, and, whatever it requires, we need to be prepared jointly with the superintendent and the board to ask for the right resources to support this work. And, the legislature made a big investment in EY to do this work, a big investment. So, I hope that we can work more collaboratively with your office as we move forward, as you manage this work.
I stand ready and willing to collaborate to make this the most efficient project and recommendations we can. I just do want to say, just to correct a statement you made, I never asked for this report for a cost savings measure.
No.
I've said since the summer, this is about improving the operations of DPI, and I'm very excited about being able to take those steps to do that.
But in the report itself, it says that this came around as, and the report, I think it's the one to the General Assembly, it's number 1 on there is
that is the language from
the General Assembly.
From the General Assembly.
That's what
Correct.
I tried to say, that, not you, but the General Assembly asked you to do that.
Thank you.
One final, I keep saying one final question.
That's
That's the
okay.
name of my question today, one final question. I like your point about some of the things that you're recommending are already inherently underway because of maybe the ELA and the curricular sections may be thinking, along with the testing and accountability, we need to do these things. So I think the least disruptive we can go about transforming, and maybe it will be through the annual work plans of separate divisions, and before you know it, one day we wake up and it's done. We are this lean, mean organization that's transforming, not ourselves, but transforming schools.
Yeah. And, I would agree that we should try to do this in a way that wherever it's possible to link this to existing work, that makes all the sense in the world. At the same time, I don't want to minimize that I think some of these things are more of a departure or would require a sort of more aggressive implementation.
Well, like regional centers would, perhaps.
Yeah. So, but conceptually, your point is well taken.
I'm not going to say my last one, just in case I do it. Number one, I just want to caution all of us on overselling. Let's make sure that we undersell and overproduce. That expectations are real important, because I said it earlier. We can fully implement this, but if we don't change the way we manage, the way we think, then it's still not going to work. I just want to comment on Eric's question about the skill level. At the risk of sounding old or say we've done that, actually, as a head of an agency here, a very large agency in the state of North Carolina in the 90s, did one of these, and in that case, again, we had the resources to do it, but I hired a deputy secretary, and the skill level, and in fact, when I interviewed him, he said, "I'm not sure I can spell environment." And the head of Environment, Health, and Natural Resources, I know it's rhetoric, but he wanted to make the point. And the skill level, though, that I was looking for is that person at that time who could look at things like TQM, who could look at Baldrige, who could look at other kinds of things and look at the way we do business, who could track things, who could look at data like a permit that's supposed to be out of that department in 90 days that was taken 200 days? How can we get it to what the law says, 90 days? And a lot of those kinds of things. This was at the deputy secretary level. Now, within the department, 200 or 300 people were on the teams that were developing those functions and the way to work in different ways. So I would say that there's a mix. There is the department that has to be part of the development of that. But I would suggest that you've got to have that at the highest level. And one of his admonitions to me was, you can't delegate this and not own it. And so I'd say that to this board. We cannot just say, hey, we have to assure that this is important enough so that we are saying, where are we now, and get our own input there. And then my final thing is that as we go along, we've got to engage the LEAs so that they're not confused, because there is, if it's going to change, we can't just flip the light switch on and one day we're doing it one way and another way. It's just real important to engage them in the process.
So, back to the report going to the General Assembly, in there specifies the 8 items that the legislation required the report to cover. Before we vote on that, I just want to make sure that in all the text that you provided, are all 8 of those items addressed?
Yes, I believe so.
So, statement regarding minimum funding necessary to ensure federal grant funds do not constitute more than 50%.
Yeah, there's a specific page on that in the final report. You can find it on.
That's fine. That's okay.
It's number 16.
Commit it to reading. In your opinion, why are we so siloed?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think that state education agencies grew up as organizations to administer funding streams. And in many ways, and this is not so much a comment on North Carolina as more generally across the country, because that drove so much of how that drove the construction of the budgets, and that drove a lot of the activities around compliance and monitoring of those funds. It made these organizations predisposed to behave in a siloed fashion because they were each dependent on different funding streams for their work. And that is, I think that's at the root of it. Yeah. And then everything that you try to do to overcome that is down to management and implementation. And I think there are ways of doing it, but it's, that's the legacy that many state education agencies are trying to overcome. And as was pointed out earlier, not just education, other state agencies that are administering their own federal funds.
Okay, thanks. Given that you've done this work in other states and so forth, in your opinion, how important is DPI to the success of the public school system in North Carolina?
I will say, first of all, that we heard a desire from the field, from superintendents and educators that we spoke to, that they want DPI to be strong, effective, and successful. And I think there is a recognition that when the state does good work, we heard that has a real positive impact on them, and that when good work is taken away, that also has an impact on them. So from that standpoint, I would say that you hear districts saying that the work of this department is important. I would also just observe, as I mentioned earlier, in a state with so many school systems that are operating at a very small scale in terms of their enrollment and therefore their revenue and their staff, it's just intrinsically challenging for each one of those systems to build on its own the level of expertise as relates to teaching, learning, curriculum, instruction, et cetera, that they will need to support their own students' goals and abilities. And so it makes sense in that state context for DPI to position itself to be able to provide a high quality level of support on evidence-based programs that is attuned to the needs of each region. So I do think that there is an important role to play, and we've heard that from the state as well.
Thanks.
I have, and maybe this will be my final question, but you just touched on something that before you answered Mr. Davis's question, and I guess this is about maybe the third round of these performance type audits that we've had in my time on the board. And I recall in the first one there was a recommendation for how senior management should be structured in order to work cross-functionally and not have silos. I mean, to your point, this isn't the first rodeo with silo discussion, but there was a specific recommendation from that consulting group about what needed to happen for senior management to create those cross-functional, however you want to term that, but basically to break down the silos. So do you have any specific recommendations? And I tried to go through all this before today, but I might have just missed it.
Yeah. We elected not to make a recommendation that was for a specific organizational structure at the senior management level. And that is because I am wary of giving an impression that there is any particular organizational design that will either inherently work or inherently not work. I think there's a lot of ways to manage, and as was mentioned earlier, to some extent you're always going to have this sort of horizontals and verticals issue that you have to manage. Now that said, I do think it is logical to take a look at the organizational structure of the agency as you launch a transformation effort like this. I think that would be sort of, in our view, the domain of the leadership of the agency to make those specific decisions or recommendations.
Occasionally I meet with a regional group, and this is going to be an interesting take on silos. Listening to their concerns and their wishes, they would like something like this particular job-alike group would like to have something like a silo or a function that works independently, because it deals with things like licensure, or it deals only with HR policies and laws. So it needs to be kind of it's unto itself. I don't want to call it a silo because we all have this kind of negative connotation around silos.
Yeah.
But an independent functioning unit
within the department you're referring to?
Yes, that responds to the needs of job-alike groups in the region.
Well, so I can understand that, and we've heard similar-ish kind of things. I just want to give an example, I think, of how this plays out. You'll note we made this recommendation around consolidating functions that are related to talent and the support of individual educators. I think today the experience of, let's say, the licensure group is that because they are a sort of field-facing group that is supporting teachers or HR-related matters, they're getting questions that are not related to licensure. They're getting a wide range of other questions that are related to policy and practice as it relates to educators. And so while I do think it is useful to make sure that different stakeholder groups within the state know where they can turn to, I also think it is the case that silos within the department can make it harder than for sometimes those people to get the answers they're looking for, because they think I can ask you X, Y, and Z, but really I can only ask you X. And I think that there are individual people, many individual people within the department who do their best to sort of extend beyond their scope to provide whatever support is needed, but it's not always by design.
Okay, I got so entranced in this discussion, I didn't watch the time.
And I have no idea.
And I just looked up, and we're past our break. So if there's any burning question or statement that needs to be made before we excuse you and thank you and take a 15-minute break. Board members, Superintendent, you have any comment?
Again, I'll just express my thanks. A lot of work went into this from EY, from people in the building, from people outside of the building. And this is a real opportunity to make some positive transformations that will ultimately better support schools and students. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and we will take a 15-minute break.
Great.
Okay. There's still an, well,
Glad to be here.
Good to see you. I'm Amy.
Yes, Andy.
Yes, and so I'm.
Thank you, John.
Way to the Virginia line.